just for everyone watching this, by the way, we haven't rehearsed this.
No,
and so
not at all.
so this is although Steve has explained this to me already in the past. Well, I don't remember everything for a start, and also the fact is that this chap who's got a lot of surprises up his sleeve, and so really we're just these questions are genuine questions, and I'll just kind of feed your attention. So keep going with Galileo and all
right.
this.
Okay, so then we get people like Galileo turning up and actually starting to do experiments to find out. Well, because the Greek law of motion, you see, Des, says if you push something, it moves, and if you stop pushing, it stops moving. Which is very sweet, isn't it? That's the law of motion I'd come up with, I think. It seems very reasonable. And
it's logical, it seems consistent with experiment to some extent.
It doesn't explain why things fall when you drop them.
Right.
And it doesn't explain when you throw things why they go like that. But most things, it kind of does explain things. And that sort of thing. But anyway, they started checking. And what they found was that even where you started off with something true and you went therefore, actually when you check out the conclusion, it's wrong.
Yeah, okay. Which is a killer, isn't it?
Which is a killer.
Yeah.
It's a killer.
So now what do you do?
Well, the consequence of that, so for maths it was fine because you're just talking about science stuff, you're not really talking about maths. Maths, no one says, oh right, every sum you do you need to get out your beads and check. Right. No one's going to say that. And science goes its own way with lots of experiments and the scientific method. And in fact, paradoxically, you end up with a very mathematical view of the universe. Take like Newton is very mathematical compared with the old sort of Aristotelian views, all sort of equations and this and that. So maths is still, very much part of it, but it's the checking.
Right.
But of course philosophy is thrown into crisis because the whole thing about philosophy, it relies on the fact you don't have to check your conclusions, because if you can check your conclusions, it's not philosophy. As soon as it becomes sort of empirical, it goes off into some other discipline. So for philosophy, you get this big thing. So instead of being able to sort of take off and fly about, so you get this.
So hang on a minute. So science, in a way, has largely replaced philosophy in terms of influence in culture.
Yes, it has. Yes.
Interesting.
Within the So basically, philosophy now can't take off. So you have to just sort of. Well, you get people called the empiricists, and they basically say you can't go beyond experience. So that means that if you like, your plane just has to sort of taxi around on the ground, doing what it can. Everything's sort of verifiable and checkable. And this idea that we can go off into the stratosphere is just forget it. Whereas you get other people called the rationalists who believe that if you were very careful, maybe you could take off and just go on sort of maybe slightly more short-haul flights than they'd gone before.
Interesting.
But they were sort of, there's always something in you that kind of wants to go off a little bit more. But in a profound way, philosophy is sort of grounded in three senses. First of all, it wasn't sort of up flying about so much anymore. Secondly, it was grounded in a sense of maybe a punishment for the hubris that said it had been able to go off on these flights, as a sort of punishment, and also grounded in the sense, empiricists would certainly say, of being sort of properly focused on things that were, like sort of clarifying concepts and that sort of thing, just making, sort of clearing the ground for science to do its work and that sort of thing. So anyway, that's kind of where it went as a result of the scientific revolution. It was a big crisis time, really, for philosophy. Okay, and so that's the second step. So the first step is you've got the Greeks with maths. Everything is maths, think maths. It's a bit like going through the national curriculum, actually. And the next, in the late Middle Ages, you've got science, which messes up philosophy no end. In huge crisis, because you need to check everything, and if you can check it, it's not really philosophy, or so according to the Greek tradition anyway. But the next huge step you get is a guy called Immanuel Kant, who's one of the giants of the world of philosophy. And at this point, one of the ways that I always sort of came to see philosophy when I was studying it was in terms of seeing and thinking. Because basically, when we confront the world, you've got this kind of visual thing that you see, and then you've also got what you think. And it's like you've got a visual track and a thinking track. And it's a question of how the two fit together. And what Hume noticed, David Hume, who was an empiricist, so he was very much stick to what you can know, and if it isn't scientifically provable, and if it's not mathematical, chuck it out, burn it, make a big sort of rubbish tip for it. And one of the things he was very strong on was this thing about causation. So he say, you look at something happening in the world, and you say this caused that, and basically what you see is that this happens and then that happens. He says, where's that thing of cause comes from? It can't be justified. You can't sort of prove it that this caused that. You can say this happened, then that happened, but the idea of some causal link, Where's that come from? That's not provable, you see.
Right, how interesting.
You see, now, and again, I think provable
he
in a
was
sort
an
of
empiricist.
he was an empiricist.
Right.
Well, he was also a determinist, so figure that one out. But anyway, I think what he was really saying was that these sort of philosophical notions are coming in, and you must only stick to what you can really justify, you see. So he was saying you can't justify this notion of causation. Now, Immanuel Kant, as I understand it, said that this thing of Hume really woke him up from his dogmatic slumbers because this troubled Kant. And he sort of agreed with Hume in the sense that he thought, well, yes, if you look at one thing and then another thing, you can't really see a cause, but the idea that you can say, okay, well, it's just all random things floating about, you can't say that either. And so, in a sense, you've got this seeing thing. If you just look at what you see, you can imagine concluding, well, this happened and that happened, but you can't help but think, this caused that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really made this huge leap forward, which I think has become part of the, something that everybody these days accepts, which is, well, again, the way I understood it was like the sort of sausage machine view of reality. When I was doing maths as functions at school, we were taught to see it as like a sausage machine. So you actually draw a sausage machine, and the idea is you put the raw meat in, which is a number, and you turn the handle, and there might be sort of add 2 or divide by 3, and out comes the sausage, you see. So you put in 4, and it's a +2 sausage machine, you turn the handle and out comes 6. Or you put in raw meat, turn the handle and out comes a sausage, right? So now the way Kant saw it was this, that basically we receive from the world raw data, raw sense data. But we never see what that looks like because it gets fed into the sausage machine of our minds. And our minds are like a gigantic sausage machine which has got 12 categories, as he calls them, that sort of basically take this raw information and actively shape it and mould it into a very sort of shiny, pristine sausage. And the sausage is what we see. So that the information that comes in doesn't contain anything about causation. But what comes in, we don't see it as it comes in. It gets processed by the mind, and what we are confronted with is a sort of a compound of seeing, but also with seeing and thinking, a bit like a baked cake that you can't unbake, which has got things like causation and this and that. I can't
That's a very appealing philosophy.
It's
actually.
a very appealing philosophy, and,
Yeah.
and also it recognised, he was the first one really who sort of had this idea that the mind is active, that you don't just sort of get this visual information and sort of look at it, but actually the mind is very active in shaping the information that comes in. And so, and it was an amazing theory. I remember because the guy who lectured on it at Bristol, Stephen Kerner, was one of the kind of world's. He'd written this little book that was in every bookshop in the world on Kant. I remember just coming out, just sitting down at the end, just being just amazing, just hearing about this as an idea, and certainly I think most people would say the idea of the mind actively shaping the information it receives, and that what we see is a sort of compound in some ways is I think that is now a sort of a truism that everybody would sort of
hold to
to a certain now how strongly, but certainly that there is truth in it. So obviously this means it's good. This is good news, and this is bad news. So for us as humans, this is good news because what it means is that we know that when we can, we'll always see. We can be secure in the idea of causation and this and that and the other because that's how we will always encounter the world. But it's bad news in that the world as it is, the unprocessed world, is completely closed off to us.
I mean, in a sense, that kind of very neatly slips into postmodernism. I don't know if you're going to
discuss that. That's what I'm coming to next.
Right.
Should I do that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So postmodernism really. So for Kant, these psychological, it's probably quite a psychological theory. Is a hardware thing. So every human being in the world, from the dawn of history or whatever, has had these categories. So we would all sort of see the world in the same way. And I think what came to happen in the 20th century, and this is particularly associated, I suppose, with people like Wittgenstein in a way, is the importance of different languages and different cultures. And so it moves from being a hardware position to a software position.
Oh, wow.
So it says that your culture, your language and your culture give you a particular map of the world.
Okay, so there may not be 12 categories in that culture. There may be 27 or 63.
Or there may be a set of categories, but the categories are interpreted differently.
Right.
You see, if you look at different cultures, so every culture would have some idea of causation, but how that works, or you know, if you look at cultures in different times and different places, they are very, very different. It's very hard to imagine what it was like to see the world as somebody from, a completely different time and place. Even someone like ancient Egypt, or you read about sort of things that are going on there, the way that people saw the world. So there's a real sort of plasticity. So it's not just that we have these categories through which we see the world, but there's obviously quite a lot of sort of plasticity about it. And I suppose what sort of ways in which this sort of comes through. I mean, one thing I noticed, for instance, to do with colours. It's quite a trivial example, but basically, if I see if I go through a forest, I see lots of different shades of green. I think green, they're all green. Somehow, even though they're very different shades of green, they all seem green, or they all seem blue. And I'm sure if I was an artist more sensitive, I would see them more, in a more refined way. Apparently in Russia, they have the green-blue divides in a different place.
Really?
Yes, so they see some of the things that we would say that's green, they see it as blue, or the other way around.
Right.
And you can imagine that, because there is a sort of a spectrum, and you can imagine that the line is drawn in different places, or you might miss a colour out. I think French have brun and marron, 2 words for brown, where we have 1 word for brown.
Right.
Now you can imagine that, and that's fine. But it means you actually see it as brown, or you see it as not, And things like writing as well. I remember talking with a friend about this many years ago, and he was making the point, when you look at a page of English writing, you don't say, what's that squiggle? Oh yes, it's an S. Or what's, you see it as writing, and you can't see it in any other way.
Yeah.
Whereas, if I look at a page of Chinese, I know that to a Chinese person, that's writing, and this is what it says. Whereas for me, I see it as squiggles, and they would see, and that's how it works, because, and it just, there's just so many ways in which the mind is really powerfully able to shape the input we get according to the sort of map it's operating with. And so this leads to a real sort of postmodern situation where you have so this leads to the arts and science departments thing,
right?
Because the arts department all say, well, every culture just has its own way of seeing it, and that's it's all just very internally referenced, really. You've got this map, that's what you stick to, that determines how you will understand any situation. So even things like science and maybe even maths are just culture dependent.
That's really shocking for a scientist.
Whereas for scientists, they say, well, hang on a minute, this isn't just, we happen to see the world this way, that way. If our science wasn't somehow penetrating deeply into the real world, planes wouldn't fly, buildings wouldn't stay up. If you get the equations wrong, things don't work. And there is a sort of, and so this idea that it's all just, is kind of...
Well, I think there's a kind of there's a real crisis, isn't there, looming here? Because in a way, culturally, we are much more postmodernistic now than 50, 60 years ago.
We are.
And yet, underpinning our society is still this very scientific, or scientistic, you could argue, worldview. Engineering, mathematics, it's still kind of firmly embedded. And yet they're kind of living in almost like 2 parallel universes.
I think that's what interested me. What interested me was that I think some people take very much a postmodernist view and say, well, that's it, everything's shaped by language culture. Other people say, no, it's all about science, and we're dealing with truth, and actually, for me, I think I hear what the ancient Greeks are saying about the power of maths. I think it's right. If I say, going back to the beans in the garden, you're right to say that actually I planted 12 and I miscounted. I think that's true. And to go and with the science thing, I think science is very powerful. And actually you are, clearly planes do fly, buildings stay up, people can do extraordinary things. And you see the fruits of that knowledge. And clearly there is a powerful interaction with reality. And also, I buy the fact that I'm aware that the way I see the world, it is a compound, the seeing and the thinking, it is a compound which is shaped a lot by the sorts of maps I'm operating with. So I agree with all those things. And what I was really interested in doing was coming up with a way of understanding the world that would have its which would acknowledge all of those and wouldn't see them as conflicting, but actually all working together somehow. And that was the challenge that, to me, is a very obvious one and rather fun, really, like sort of trying to solve a bit of a crossword.
Fantastic. So we're going to break
Should we have a
shortly.
break?
Yeah, we'll have a break, and in the next video we'll actually talk about the solution.
The solution. Well, it might be, I don't know. It's my two penneth.
No, it's just fascinating.